A quote attributed to various people says that all that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. Well, in this video, I'm going to tell you about a good person who did something. Lots, in fact, to battle racism, fascism, and greed. But he did so while maintaining a wide smile, colorful and irreverent wit, and generous spirit. Ira Grupper, born in 1944 in Brooklyn, New York, to Orthodox Jewish parents, watched, like good people everywhere, in horror in 1964 as three civil rights workers were murdered for registering black voters in Mississippi. But unlike the great majority of us up north who were safe in our beds at night, Ira went to rural Mississippi the following year to help resume the work of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. He worked in and around Hattiesburg and Columbia, Mississippi, and Atlanta, Georgia, with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee helping to register blacks and get the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. Ira, who died in July 2024 at age 80, had dedicated his life to fighting tirelessly for racial justice, worker rights, peace, and the rights of the disabled, a cause that was also his own. He was a visually impaired person who had battled discrimination to rise out of poverty as a unionized factory worker. Ira spoke with the British-based group Journey to Justice about what inspired him to join the struggle.
These four African American college students sat down, had a lunch counter, asked to be served, and they were not served. They refused to move. This made headlines all across the country. They were refusing to move. They just stayed there. That night, my father came home from work and told me about this. And my father was a very progressive person. He wanted justice for all, but he was not an activist the way you and I are activists, Carrie. And he said that the following morning, there would be a demonstration in front of a store in New York that's owned by the same company that refused to serve these black college students in North Carolina. And I was living in New York, of course. I was born and raised in New York. So he said, Ira, would you like to join me? And I got very excited. I really wanted to join him. But I was 16 years old. I was a college student, a high school student, rather. I had pimples. I was very skinny, although you wouldn't know that now. And I wanted to be like everybody else. I didn't want to stand out. I didn't want to possibly get arrested. I certainly didn't want my friends or my teachers to see me taking off from school that day. But I thought about it. Thought and thought. And I said, yes, I'm going to go. And I did. And I was so proud to be with Daddy. He and I marched with you. And these were mostly working class people in this area, because that's where I grew up, in a working class area. And very few people crossed the line to go into the store. The boycott was effective there. That was my baptism. I don't know if you'd say it was by fire, but by commitment to the civil rights movement. And from then on, I began to read everything I could get my hands on. Now, I grew up in a housing project, poor project, in New York City. They say all Jews have money. Well, they must have passed over my house, because we didn't have a lot of money. I was never so poor as to have missed a meal, but my father was unemployed at times, and my mother wasn't working, and so my brother and I had to struggle sometimes. And in this project, there were blacks and whites and Latinos and Irish and Italian and maybe other nationalities as well, but those are the ones I remember. And people generally got along okay. Yes, there were tough people there, and there were robberies and etc. But because it was rough. But people generally learned to get along with one another. Well, I'm skipping now to a few more years later. I was about 17 or 18 or 19 and became very involved in the civil rights movement in New York City on my own. I was quite aware that racism was not just a phenomenon of the South, the southern part of the United States. It was all across the country. And so if I was going to protest, I was going to protest where I lived, in New York City. However, having said that, Carrie, the fulcrum of attention, the place where the pimple had burst, where the rubber hit the road, as they say, the main activity was in the South for the civil rights movement. And so I first went south to the state of Georgia. I was on the staff of SNCC, SNCC, which stands for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, one of the most courageous and perspicacious and forward-thinking groups in the civil rights movement, and very militant as well.
Ira, a devoted father of four, also taught college courses in civil rights and the Middle East at Bellarmine University in Louisville, Kentucky, the city where he had lived since 1969. He came to the city on the Ohio River to work with the ardent civil rights organization Southern Conference Educational Fund and two of its top organizers, Ann and Carl Braden. That began a long tenure by Ira of working with and leading efforts based in Louisville for equal protection and inclusiveness. In the late 1990s up through 2011, Ira wrote a column about labor and other leftist matters for Forsooth, a newspaper of the Fellowship of Reconciliation Louisville chapter, a monthly print and online publication which I edited. He called his column Labor Pains. A pain is a statement of praise. Still, Ira was concerned that use of the play on words might be seen as insensitive given what women giving birth go through. But in the more than a dozen years we ran Labor Pains, we received no complaints about the column's name. In his column, Ira often looked back admiringly at the absolute courage of black Mississippi activists he had known, such as Vernon Dahmer, a colleague of his who was murdered by the Ku Klux Klan. Ira also wrote about the warm relationships he had with many in the Deep South who stood up against the generations of oppressions of their families. One person was Mary Spencer of Columbia, Mississippi. Ira wrote, Ms. Mary was one of the most dedicated freedom fighters I have ever known. She was smart, tenacious, determined, and kind and gentle as well. Ira said she generously fed him and other civil rights workers despite facing reprisals from the white establishment, including having her home foreclosed on because of her work against segregation. Ira was involved in the organizing of the Selma to Montgomery March in 1965, serving as a coordinator of information in Atlanta, staffing a phone line to the national media. Part of his job was to debunk any rumors spread by right wingers, giving media reports of what was really happening on the march as it was relayed to the Atlanta office. The issue of racial equality, as central as it was to Ira Grupper's being, wasn't nearly all that filled his daily agenda of helping people in his hometown of Louisville, where he had lived since 1969, or in the wider world. Ira visited the Middle East in the late 1990s and early 2000s to speak, organize, and write in favor of a Palestinian state and an end to the wars there. From 1989 to 93, he had served as a national co-chairperson for the New Jewish Agenda, a group which called for Israel to dismantle its permanent settlements in the West Bank, pull its military back to pre-1967 borders, and negotiate with the Palestinian Liberation Organization about creating a state for Palestinians. Ira said those agenda points, even though they represented the outlook of most progressive Jews, drew anger from many established Jewish organizations. Livid was the word Ira used in an interview he did with Forsooth to describe the reaction of many U.S. Jewish leaders when the New Jewish Agenda called for negotiations to create a Palestinian state. Ira made a trip to Cuba in the 1990s to support efforts to end the U.S. trade embargo against that nation. There, he met with Cuban labor leaders and all exchanged views where they had common interests on issues affecting workers. That's a genre that included Ira, an activist and shop steward with the Bakery, Confectionery, and Tobacco Workers Union while he worked at the Philip Morris tobacco plant in Louisville. The group arranged a return visit to the U.S. by the Cubans to continue the public dialogue, but that visit, scheduled for the early 2000s, never happened. At the last minute, the George W. Bush administration's repressive State Department blocked the Cuban labor leaders from entering the U.S. Of course, they couldn't block Ira from continuing to write and speak about the labor exchange. In his obituary, some of Ira's grown children, after noting their father's skill at reciting poems from memory, his self taught esoteric knowledge of political philosophy, and his informal singing and whistling, wrote, "The world is more than a smidge quieter without Ira's Donald Duck impression, indecorous language, and boisterous room entrances." As a friend of Ira Grupper, as well as an editor of his columns and a colleague in many of his social justice actions, I recognize all of those traits. Ira Grupper was a radical in the finest sense, working for solutions at the root cause of our problems, not just applying band-aids out on the fringes. He told an interviewer in 2006 in a civil rights archive that two things that formulated his radical left orientation were seeing television coverage of Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 when he was 11, and reading about and attending rallies of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, who had fought for the left in the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939. He said those events allowed him to take the basic concern for fairness and goodness in the world taught to him by his parents, Harry and Selma Grupper, and turn them into a more specific political philosophy. In much more recent years, Ira was a member of the Louisville chapter of the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism, a grassroots organization which in the 1990s organized for a worker-run economy and a people-run government, while power was moving in the opposite direction as multinational corporations were tightening their grip and setting us up for the financial and social crises that have come since. Ira traveled to Europe in the middle part of the 2010s as part of a delegation studying the troubling rise of fascist movements on the continent. He returned just as the same plague was surging in the U.S., and he said the excess power of multinational corporations was clearly the cause. Ira was always willing to work for justice through mainstream sources like City Hall, centrist unions, and the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Ira served three separate stints over several decades as a member of the Louisville Jefferson County Human Relations Commission, which enforces civil rights and equal employment laws in the city. He was a voice for more assertive enforcement of those laws. He had been an activist during the 60s with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and during a 2006 Labor Pains column, Ira championed the forming of Progressive Democrats of America in 2004 to move the Democratic Party to average people, not the corporate elites to whom it buddied up during the Bill Clinton years. Overall, he and other progressives were dismayed at the failure of the powers that be in the party to get that message in the years that followed. But gloom was never Ira's way. He had seen Red Scares, he had been arrested and beaten in the South, he had slept on the floor of his Mississippi hosts' homes during the 1960s, so he'd be below the line where late-night bullets had previously come. And Ira had gotten through all that, always mindful of the progress that had been bought with courage. And he emerged with his Donald Duck voice, boisterous room entrances, and his smile as wide as ever.